Hey, deserving listeners, a lot of you have been asking me to react to some videos regarding the latest developments in the story about Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt. So let's see what happened in court recently. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Okay, so this first video that someone sent me is on TikTok, and it is by Julie Louise 1975. Let's watch.
Trigger warning right now, guys, because this is way worse than I thought. As you know, Ruby Franke was in court today. She pled guilty to 4 out of the 6 child abuse charges, and she has agreed to testify against Jodi Hildebrandt.
Okay, we're learning that Ruby Franke pled guilty to 4 out of the 6 charges. I'm going to take a guess and say that those 4 were either charges that held less of a consequence, less of a sentence, and also perhaps were more difficult to refute.
Statement released by her lawyer this week, it sounds like she is putting a lot of the blame on Jodi Hildebrandt.
So it's interesting. She's pleading guilty to 4 out of 6 and probably also saying, look, some of the more egregious crimes I had nothing to do with, or I was coerced into doing it or something.
Ruby did have family members in attendance today. She had her brother Beau, her sister Julie, and her parents were also there. It appears they have returned home. They did appear to arrive together, and when Ruby entered the courtroom, she did turn and look at them and smiled. If you haven't seen the courtroom footage yet, it is in my previous post. I'm going to now read to you exactly what Ruby has admitted to, the things that she has done to her 2 youngest children, her 10-year-old daughter and her 12-year-old son. She's admitted to 4 counts out of the 6 of child abuse.
Okay, so it's limited to just 2 of the children. I think there's 5 or 6 kids in the family, and the 10 and the 12-year-old. I think that is because those were the 2 kids who were found to have escaped Jodi Hildebrandt's house from the torture that they were experiencing. And I don't say that lightly. The allegations were that the hands and feet were bound, perhaps for many hours, perhaps for days. The children had been denied food and water. Yeah, I mean, that's torture. It's like against the Geneva Convention, that kind of thing. So I'm guessing that those are the 2 kids that are focused on. But it sounds like abuse for all the kids, including one of the children, the oldest child, the daughter, who has moved out.
And it appears to have started May 22nd, 2023. I am going to read some.
All right, so May 22nd, 2023, that's at least what the court is or what the prosecutor is focusing on. Maybe it's easier to prosecute those crimes. I don't know. That's interesting.
This just to make sure that I get all the facts straight, so bear with me. One of the first things I noticed in this document was that it does appear that Ruby Franke is taking responsibility for doing some of this to her children. It's worded like this: Ruby intentionally or knowingly inflicted and allowed another adult to inflict serious physical injuries upon her 9 and 11-year-old children.
All right, so it does sound like those are the 2 children that are of concern to the prosecutor, and the charge is that she committed the crimes and or knew that the crimes were being committed on the children by, I'm guessing, Jodi Hildebrandt.
Year old children. So it does say that she inflicted this as well. The first count of child abuse has to do with physical torture of her 12-year-old son. It says that initially she was forcing him to do physical labor for hours and days at a time. And the examples listed were doing wall sits, which is when you put your back up against a wall and squat down. It's absolute torture.
Yeah, so for some of you, you might be thinking, well, that's kind of weird that you would have your kid do wall sits. Like, why would that be hard? Because it's an exercise that some people do voluntarily. How is that torturous? Well, I will tell you that in my early career, first 10 or 15 years, about 1/3 of my clients were families that had defiant teenagers. And a very small set of those defiant teenagers were sent to boot camps or behavioral camps by the parents, usually against my recommendation. The parents would be struggling with a defiant teenager for various different reasons. Sometimes it would be the parents' fault, or I would hypothesize that the parents were a major factor in that. But sometimes not. Sometimes kids just fall into the wrong crowd. Just a lot of paths to teenage rebellion and defiance. And by defiance, I'm talking about pretty high-level defiance, like running away for a month at a time, no longer going to school at all, committing various different crimes over the span of years, being violent with family or people in the community, selling drugs out of the house. We're not talking about just coming home late from curfew or going to a party one night or so. We're talking about pretty high level. And I would be helping the families, and for the richer families, they would consider sending the kids to these boot camps. I did a whole series about Paris Hilton. She was sent to one of these locations. Well, one of the things that I would hear from the kids when they would return, and by the way, I recommended these parents consider not sending their kids to these camps because the camps often would advertise a rate of success at like a 97% level. They would say 97% of the kids that are sent to our camp are totally reformed and everything is fine. Listen to these families talk about how wonderful our camp is. And I would look into it and find that those were grossly exaggerated numbers. And anecdotally, I would find that would be true. The vast majority of kids that came out of these camps that I worked with did not change their behavior. Often it was worse because they were even more angry at their parents, right? So I would recommend for that. But also I recommended parents not do it because it's so damn expensive. I had a single mother one time that decided against my recommendation to send their kid to this camp, and she had to take out like a second mortgage on her house. She didn't have the savings, and it's very, very expensive. It's on the order of tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if it had a guaranteed success rate, maybe, but to waste that much money on a gamble and also potentially harm a child and cause an even greater rift to occur between you and your child. But anyway, so one of the things that I would hear from these kids when they would return, particularly the kids who were sent out of the country, because some of these camps, they're not in the United States. And as far as I can tell, the reason why these camps aren't because they market to American families, but they are not in the United States. And one of the major reasons, as far as I can tell, and of course, I have no way of confirming this, is that they can get away with more torturing of children in another country. There's still laws in our country that you have to follow depending on the state. And that's another thing. Some states like Utah have lower protections for children in situations like this. So even, in other countries, they might have even lower, if at all. So one of the things I would hear from these teenagers is they would come back and they would tell me that they would be doing a lot of wall sits as a punishment. And at first I thought, well, that sounds not so bad. I mean, it's not great, but it's better than being hit or spanked or something. And they would say, no, it's way worse. Because, of course, they don't just say do a wall sit for as long as you can. They make you do a wall sit way beyond what is probably possible for them. And if they don't achieve that time, then they just have to start over again. And, if you've ever worked out and you've really pushed yourself, the effect that it has on your mind, on your soul. You have one more mile to run and you're already just so tired. It is very, very hard. Even though your body physically is capable of running that next mile, it's very, very taxing on one's mind and can really mess you up, right? This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's a new year, so of course it's time for New Year's resolutions. But often those are just manifestations of internalized harmful voices that tell us we're not good enough. So instead of making a resolution to change something, let's recognize that we are already good enough. Now, most people think of therapy as a place for us to work on our problems, but there are several schools of thought within the field of psychotherapy that adamantly reject that paradigm, like narrative therapy and solution-focused. Instead, these clinicians help us focus on what we're already doing well. And by helping us do that, data shows that we often will gravitate towards more beneficial patterns. Well, one place you can find such therapists is on BetterHelp. If you're thinking of starting therapy, it's definitely worth giving a try. So celebrate the progress you've already made. Visit betterhelp.com/Kirk today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Kirk.
Anyone that has tried to do this. The other is carrying boxes of heavy books up and down stairs repeatedly. And the third example was the fact that he was being forced to work outside and do labor outside in the crazy Utah heat.
Yeah, we've heard other kinds of allegations like this, but to learn that the official allegations from the prosecutor that are being agreed to by Ruby Franke, before we had a lot of different accounts, and we could believe a lot of the accounts, but you just have to figure that when investigators look into this sort of thing, and when court's involved and law enforcement is involved, then there's much more precision. We can rely on the data, to a greater degree. And yeah, similarly, right? Because you think, well, carrying boxes of books up and down stairs, that's not so bad. I mean, whenever I move to another place, there's a lot of boxes that I'm carrying, right? It's not torture. But when you do it all day long, and really when it's your parents that is telling you, you will not eat until you do this 1,000 times, or because you, came home from curfew, 10 minutes late, I am now going to sadistically harm you for the next 3 days by doing X, Y, and Z. That really does a number on your psyche, on your attachment, on your mental health. To see someone that is supposed to have your back. I mean, your parents are supposed to be someone that is the safest place that you can go, right? And yet this is the least safest person to be with. So that will really be harmful to individuals. I worry greatly about these kids. I've seen a lot of kids as they're being abused or after just being abused, as a therapist. And of course, I've seen a lot of adults of varying ages who had childhoods like this and for the rest of their life affected them in a very, very significant way. Like one of the thousands of effects that it can have on someone is that they will have to suppress their anger. I recently published an audio episode about anger and rage and about how parentified kids will learn, because they're being parentified, that they cannot even recognize their anger. And so you can have someone who's 45 years old and has yet to express any anger or feel okay to feel their own anger. And that can be very, very destructive, not only internally, but just in terms of one's life. Anger is very important. You have to be able to know when you're angry so that you can be motivated to take action, because often we're angry when there's an injustice happening, either to others or to ourselves. So if you have a lifetime of never being in connection with your anger or feeling guilty or ashamed of having anger, then it's possible for some of these people, I've seen this, where literally their entire life is an injustice upon them, because if they don't stand up for themselves, it's possible that no one else will, right? So that's just one of the results of having that kind of childhood. It's not just harmful in the moment. Of course it is, but the damage can often last a lifetime.
As you know, in Utah, temperatures can get up to over 100 degrees. This is one of the things that Jodi Hildebrandt's neighbor had actually told the police about, was that she would look outside and she would see the children outside in crazy hot temperatures doing gardening.
Yeah, that's another aspect to this story that is just so infuriating, that the authorities had been contacted about both of these women multiple times, not just from random people like online, but we're talking about neighbors with firsthand accounts. It's one thing for someone to watch a video of Ruby Franke and call CPS and say, hey, she's being abusive. Without witnessing it yourself, it can, and sometimes the videos were a little vague about what exactly was happening. But when you have neighbors, and particularly when you have family members, and particularly when you have direct family members, Ruby Franke's, or one of them, I think, was it Jodi Hildebrandt, or one of them, they have sisters who have been calling the authorities for years, their own children, Jodi Hildebrandt's brother's kid, people who went through these behavioral management programs are calling CPS repeatedly with detailed accounts, evidence, maybe recordings, and the authorities did nothing. Nothing. Why are those agencies in existence if they do nothing? It'd be like having a police force in your city that never leaves the precinct. They just sit there and eat donuts all day and never answer the phone. Like, why do you exist? Why are we paying you? What is the point that might as well have not even had you in the first place? In fact, maybe that would have been better, because then people would know right from the beginning that no one's going to do anything. All these people have been calling the Utah authorities, and they did nothing until you had children who have obvious evidence of torture and being bound and denied water and food. And really, I'm surprised that they did something then, because other reports had been made. Maybe not that severe, but close. Maybe because the news got involved right away, social media got involved, I don't know. And then you think, what about all the other families in Utah? Certainly these two individuals, Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt, aren't the only adults in Utah who are abusing their kids. That's absurd. And how many other families have been calling the authorities and had a similar fate of the authorities doing nothing and the abuse happening over and over again? Abuse is happening all the time. That's one of the most depressing things you realize when you enter the field of mental health or a similar field. You realize, of course, we all understand that intellectually, but when you really see it up front and close, you realize, oh my God, this is happening all the time. Very few of these cases actually get reported to the authorities. So when they are reported to the authorities, we need to act because so few of them we are alerted to. At least we can do something about those that come forward. And we want to send a message to everyone else that we will respond as a society. And I say we because these agencies are paid for by the government, which is elected by the people. So we all can play a part in this regarding awareness and voting and tax allocation and raising taxes. Sometimes it's a matter of raising property taxes or sales taxes or income taxes to fund these kinds of agencies. Sometimes these agencies, they just don't have the resources or the employees to even address these kinds of things. I would see that too. I would talk to Child Protective Service agency workers, and they would tell me that, look, I have 500 children that I have been alerted to who are experiencing abuse. They all qualify as a family or a child that deserves to have intervention. Sometimes it meant taking the kid out of the house. Sometimes it meant sending a therapist into the house. They would hire me to do that sometimes, and other therapists in the area. Sometimes it meant parenting classes, just some kind of measure to try to stop the abuse happening to the child. And what the agency worker would tell me is, but we only have so much money, and all of those things cost money. So I can only give 200 families the services. The other 300 families will get nothing because we literally can't afford it, because we haven't raised the taxes, because there's a new government in town or some sort of anti-tax politician that either is heavily limiting the tax dollars or is reducing taxes, and we just don't have the money. I mean, just think about that. And again, it's not some foreign agency, it's an agency of the people, and so we can change that. All right, well, let's adjourn there. Tune in next time when I continue watching this story, and everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.